When it comes to historical events, I often find myself chanting that those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it, and trust me when I say no one wants to repeat any of the awfulness I'm about to talk about. Question for you: what historical event do you think needs more attention? Let me know in the comments and let's travel back in time together. We're gonna kick off today with Los Desaparecidos, or the Disappeared, also termed the Dirty War, and lasting from 1976 to 1983. This was a 7-year campaign by the Argentine government against suspected dissidents and subversives. In September of 1973, Chile's then president, Salvador Allende, was overthrown in a coup assisted by the US government, and General Augusto Pinochet took control. Now, he was a violent leader who wanted to instill fear in anyone who opposed him. Journalists, politicians, celebrities, anybody who was like, I don't like that guy, well, they kinda just disappeared. Some of them were later found dead in alleyways or ditches throughout Santiago, the capital, while others were just never found. This crazy leader frequently used the National Stadium as a secret detention center where he rounded up those who opposed him and flayed or killed them. Around 40,000 people were punished and tormented during his 17-year regime, and at least 3,200 were killed or disappeared. Now, the disappearances have left a deep scar in Argentine society for decades, in particular on those who had a relative taken away by the security forces. The pattern was similar for those arrested. Many folks were just taken from their home in the middle of the night, tormented at these detention centers, and then disposed of. Even pregnant women were arrested during this period. They were kept in prison until their offspring was born, and then the mothers were killed, and their descendants were illegally adopted by military families. The Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo is a human rights organization that was founded in 1977 to locate those kidnapped during the repression and to return them to their surviving biological families. The work of the Grandmothers has led to the location of more than 10% of the estimated 500 that were kidnapped or born in detention during this era and then illegally adopted, but that still leaves way too many families disrupted beyond repair, which honestly breaks my heart. It doesn't get any better, folks. It's time to talk about the 1871 Chinese massacre in Los Angeles. On October 24th, a mob of 500 men raided Chinatown in LA, killing at least 20 Chinese Americans and stealing an estimated $1.5 million worth of property. The killings were in response to a weapons firing event that had taken place the same day that had killed police officer Robert Thompson. The event caused a commotion and people began shouting that the Chinese were killing white people. So chaos ensued. I think 19 immigrants were confirmed to be dead, 15 of whom were rope necklaced by the mob in the course of the riot. At least one was mutilated when the member of the mob cut off a finger to obtain the victim's diamond ring, and those killed represented over 10% of the small Chinese population of LA at the time, which numbered 172 prior to the massacre. 10 men of the mob were prosecuted, and 8 were indeed convicted of manslaughter in these deaths. The convictions were overturned, though, on appeal due to technicalities. A few 21st century sources have described this as the largest mass extinction event in American history. It was the start of a decade of violence against Asian American communities in the US and led to the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited all immigration of Chinese laborers. The effects of that day were felt for a very long time. Here's another historical doozy, and that's the start of the Tuskegee syphilis study in 1932. Black men in Macon County, Alabama, volunteered to undergo special treatment for bad human redness. They had seen signs in their neighborhood claiming that the government and county health department was going to treat them. What they didn't know was that they were actually signing up to be part of the study of untreated syphilis amongst black men. The purpose of the study was to observe the effects of the disease when untreated, though by the end of the study, medical advancements meant it was entirely treatable, and the men weren't informed of the nature of the experiment, so more than 100 died as a result. There were, I think, 399 men who were diagnosed with syphilis, and they were made to believe that they were going to receive treatment for any symptoms of their bad redness. Doctors in the area were told not to treat those in the study, but just examine them to observe their symptoms. Now, I think the guys were initially told that the experiment was only going to be 6 months, but it was extended to 40 years. After funding for treatment was lost, the study was continued without informing the men that they were never going to be treated. None of the infected men were treated with penicillin, despite the fact that by 1947, that was pretty widely available and was the standard treatment for syphilis. But the study continued on, under numerous public health service supervisors, until 1972, when a leak to the press resulted in termination. I think it was on November 16th of that year, when they were like, game over, pal. Its revelation led to the 1979 Belmont Report and the establishment of the Office for Human Research Protections, and federal laws and regulations requiring institutional review boards for the protection of human subjects and studies. The OHRP for short manages this responsibility within the United States Department of Health and Human Services. Now, it wasn't until May 16th of 1997, when President at the time Bill Clinton formally apologized on behalf of the United States to victims of the study, calling it shameful and racist. Took people in power long enough. Like, that was only 27 years ago. Here we go again with the Armenian genocide of 1915. Like many similar events throughout history, this one started because of religious disputes. Armenia became part of the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century and was primarily a Christian country, which displeased the leaders and resulted in the mistreatment of Christian Armenians, who were often taxed more heavily and given fewer rights. When Armenians began to protest, Turkish military officials began killing hundreds of thousands of Armenian people. The massacres began in 1896, but it was in 1914, after the Turks entered World War I on the side of the Germans, that the mass genocide began. Spearheaded by the ruling committee of Union and Progress, or CUP for short, it was implemented primarily through the mass killing of around 1 million Armenians during death marches to the Syrian desert and the forced Islamization of others. Military leaders felt that Armenians were traitors, and on April 24th of 1915, they executed hundreds of leaders, which only led to more violence against the Armenian people, which continued until 1922. Like, it's been just over 100 years since this ended. That's not long at all. Alright, how about we talk about the dark year next? So in 536 AD, parts of the world experienced darkened skies, colder weather, and crop failures. During what is considered to be the worst year to have been alive, a volcano or multiple volcanoes erupted, expelling their ash across the northern hemisphere. There isn't a firm consensus as to which volcano it was, with possible candidates in Iceland, North America, but Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia all experienced a volcanic winter, setting off the coldest decade of the last 2,300 years. Now this resulted in what is known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age. While this volcanic eruption wreaked havoc as it was, it also helped contribute to the destructiveness of the plague of Justinian. This dark era saw summer temperatures so low that it snowed across China in August. Crops failed, people starved, so obviously during this time a lot of people died. The European population declined, and possibly by as much as a third. Like that's a lot. Back to icky human stuff we go, specifically human experimentation by Japanese Unit 731 during the mass extinction events of the 30s and 40s, committed primarily against innocent Chinese civilians. Nothing I've ever heard of in my life, including in fiction, is darker than the horrors committed for years by this unit, which was a military biological and chemical weapons research division of the Japanese Imperial Military. Now, there's not enough time today to list the half of it. I'd be here for way too long. But here's a taste. Dissections of living, new humans, fresh humans, pregnant women, without anesthesia, usually after they had been deliberately exposed and left to suffer from horrible diseases, chemical and biological weapons, and more. Oh, you want to know other ones? Okay, well, freezing limbs off of victims, horror movie style sadistic surgeries involving cutting off limbs and attaching them to the wrong sides of a victim, or removing organs and connecting the tubes back together without the organs to see what would happen. If you want an example, because I guess you do, let's see, running the esophagus straight to the intestines with no stomach in between, just to see what was gonna happen. Not to mention that the victims were routinely tormented for the fun of it, without even the flimsy excuse of science being conducted. Like, this makes Mengele look like a misunderstood humanitarian. Like, at least his horrors had a point. I'm not condoning them. And we're talking about like thousands upon thousands of victims here. Usually innocent Chinese civilians, political prisoners, POWs, and the homeless, over the course of years in huge facilities with thousands of staff committing these atrocities. The icing on the cake? General MacArthur and the rest of the US government found out about it when they captured Japan, and they granted Unit 731 immunity for their war crimes, so long as they shared their findings with America and only America. Yeah, many of the former Unit 731 members went on to have very successful and profitable futures in Japan after the war, which, I'm sorry, that disgusts me. Here's something that I'd never heard about before today: human zoos. Like, sure, I knew about sideshow and freak show history, and it's kind of exploitative as it is, and it wasn't great, but that's only the tip of the damn iceberg. So in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Western world was desperate to see the savage, primitive people described by explorers and adventurers scouting out new lands for colonial exploitation. To feed the frenzy, thousands of indigenous individuals from Africa, Asia, and the Americas were brought to the United States and Europe, often under dubious circumstances, to be put on display in a quasi-captive life in human zoos. So I was looking through pictures of the exhibits, for lack of a better word, and one that really stood out to me was the Filipino zoo girl. She was on display in the Coney Island Zoo in 1914, and this exhibit was known as the World in Miniature and was located in Luna Park. This young girl was bound by ropes and people tossed peanuts at her, just for fun. I don't don't know, it might just be me, but I find it heartbreaking to see something like that happen, especially to somebody so young. Many people have no idea these zoos existed, but they're definitely a dark part of history. And what's crazy is that there are still some that have popped up in the 21st century. I don't think they're as cool as they used to be, but like this still exists. Oh, here's something Canada tries to pretend never happened. Residential schools. These were government-sponsored religious schools that were established to forcibly assimilate Indigenous youths into Euro-Canadian culture. However, the schools disrupted lives in communities, causing long-term problems amongst Indigenous peoples. An estimated 6,000 students died at the damn schools because they were isolated, their culture was scorned, made fun of, they were removed from their homes and parents, and were often separated from their siblings because the schools were segregated according to gender. In most cases, they were forbidden to speak their first language. They couldn't even write it in letters home to their parents. Now, all attempts to assimilate children began the moment they arrived. If you were a guy, your hair was chopped. You were stripped of your traditional clothes, you were given new uniforms, and new names, because Christian missionary staff spent a lot of time and attention on Christian practices, and criticized or made fun of and dismissed Indigenous spiritual traditions. By the way, the last residential school closed only in 1996, which was only a year before I was born. Since then, former students have demanded recognition and restitution, resulting in the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement in 2007 and a formal apology by Prime Minister Stephen Harper in 2008. In total, an estimated 150,000 First Nation young folks attended residential schools, which is far too many lives harmed. Here's a lesser-known story from history, the Great Molasses Flood. So in 1919, a peculiar disaster struck the streets of Boston. A massive wave of molasses. A large storage tank filled with 2.3 million US gallons of molasses burst, and the resulting wave rushed through the streets at an estimated 35 miles per hour, killing 21 people and injuring 150. The event entered local folklore, and residents reported for decades afterwards, and I think to this day, that when it's really warm out, they still smell molasses. Look, I like bacon with the stuff, but not that much. And we're ending today with the Tsunami explosive event. So during the mass extinction event I'm not supposed to talk about, scientists in New Zealand devised a secret plan to create a tsunami device capable of flooding coastal cities and incapacitating enemies. The project commenced after US Navy officer E.A. Gibson noticed small waves generated by explosions used to clear coral reefs. So the idea was developed by the United States and New Zealand military in a program code named Project SEAL. The weapons concept was deemed feasible, but the weapons themselves were never fully developed or used, whereas a related concept, the bouncing device, was developed and used in the Yahtzee years, to be dropped into water as a means to destroy German dams and cause loss of industrial capacity and widespread flooding. So sure, while the thing technically never got made, the research from this project led to devastating explosives that we know today.